The first time the Empire knocked on Grandpa's door, the world ended quietly, not with fire, not with screams, but with 3 slow taps that carried the sound of fate. Grandpa froze beside the hearth, his hands trembling over a weak flame, and curled close to the warmth was the tiniest dragon anyone had ever seen, enough to fit in an old man's arms, broken enough to look like he did not belong in any legend. His wings were torn, scales were cracked, like old stone. A collar of black iron clung to his neck, glowing faintly with cursed runes. The dragon lifted one golden eye and looked at Grandpa, like a child waiting for abandonment. Grandpa whispered softly, "Stay close, Ember." That was his name. A bake, soon name a bake, as even the smallest flame can survive the longest night. Grandpa was not a hero, he was not a warrior, he was just an old forgotten man hiding at the edge of the forest. The village beyond the trees called him useless, they called him strange, some even whispered that tragedy followed him like a shadow. But Grandpa never argued, he simply lived alone, cooking simple meals, keeping the fire warm, talking only to the tiny dragon who never judged him. Years ago, on the coldest winter night, Grandpa had found Ember half buried in snow. The dragon was barely alive, chains were snapped off his body, blood stained the ice, and in his eyes was not anger, but sorrow, like he had already learned that the world only wanted dragons as weapons. Grandpa had knelt beside him and spoken the only truth that mattered: "You are not a monster." Ember did not move, so Grandpa carried him. Anyway, he carried a dragon home, as if carrying his own last reason to keep breathing. Since then, Ember stayed by the hearth. He never grew large, he never breathed great flames, only small warmth enough to keep Grandpa alive, enough to keep loneliness away, until the Empire came knocking. The door creaked open. 3 soldiers stood outside, armored in black steel. The crest of the Empire burned on their cloaks like a threat. One of them sniffed the air. "We smell dragon fire." Grandpa's heart thundered. "This is only an old man's hearth," he said. The soldiers' eyes sharpened. "Do not lie." They pushed inside without invitation, and then they saw Ember, the smallest dragon, the last forbidden flame. One soldier laughed cruelly. So the rumors were true. Another stepped closer, voice cold. "The Empire has been searching for the cursed one." Ember flinched at that word. "Cursed?" Grandpa stepped in front of him. "He is not cursed," Grandpa said. "He has hurt." The soldiers raised chains. "That creature belongs to the crown." Grandpa's voice broke with desperation. "He belongs to nobody." The leader unsheathed his sword. "Then you will die with him." The strike came fast. Grandpa fell, hard blood spilled across the wooden floor. Ember screamed, a sound filled with pure grief, not rage, just heartbreak. The soldiers grabbed Ember by the collar. Ember tried to crawl back to Grandpa, shaking violently, but his broken wings could not lift him, his small body could not fight an Empire. Grandpa coughed, reaching weakly. "Ember, don't let them." Ember looked back one last time, golden eyes filled with fear and love, and then the soldiers dragged him away into the night. The hearth went cold, and Grandpa lay alone in silence for days. Grandpa barely lived. The cottage felt empty without Ember's warmth. The fire would not stay lit, not because Grandpa could not feed it, but because his heart was ash. The village did nothing. No one came, no one cared. They feared the Empire more than they cared about an old man. But Grandpa refused to die, because dying meant leaving Ember alone in darkness. So he stood wounded and shaken, and he began to walk. Every step was agony, but love is heavier than pain. He followed the tracks toward the palace where dragons were turned into weapons. Grandpa had known that palace once, long ago, before he became nothing, before the Empire erased his name. He had been a flame warden, one of the last keepers of dragon bonds. He had watched the Empire chain dragons, break them, curse them. He spoke against it, and they destroyed his life. Now they had taken Ember, and Grandpa would not let that be the end. On the 7th night, he reached the capital, the palace, rose like a mountain of arrogant torches burned high and. Yet the air felt cold. Grandpa slipped into the lower halls, his body weak, but his purpose stronger than steel. Then he heard, Ita, dragon, crying, not fierce, not angry, just suffering. Grandpa's eyes filled with tears. They were hurting. Ember deep beneath the palace. He found the dungeon. There was Ember, chained in the center of a ritual circle. His scales bled, his collar glowed brighter. Feeding on pain, a mage stood chanting, submit. The mage hissed, burn for the crown. Ember trembled, his golden eyes were dull. Now like hope had been beaten out of him. Grandpa stepped forward, stopped the mage, turned sharply, an old man, broken, trembling. How did you get here? Grandpa's voice was quiet. You do not deserve him. The mage laughed. This dragon is cursed. His flame rejects command. That is why we will break him until he obeys. Grandpa's hands clenched. No. His flame is pure. The mage raised his staff. Leave or die. Grandpa did not move. He walked to the bars. Ember lifted his head slowly, and when he saw Grandpa, something flickered, a tiny spark, a memory of warmth. Grandpa whispered, I came back. Ember made a sound like a sob. The mage's face twisted. You stole him. I saved him. Grandpa whispered, you delayed destiny. The mage began chanting again. The collar flared. Ember screamed, shaking violently. Grandpa slammed his hands against the iron bars. Enough. The air trembled, flickered wildly. The mage hesitated. What are you? Grandpa reached into his cloak and pulled out an old, broken sigil, a symbol of the flame wardens. The mage's eyes widened. That order is dead. Grandpa's voice rose. It was buried. Not dead. He began speaking words in ancient dragon tongue. A forgotten promise, a bond. Ember's collar cracked. The cursed runes faltered. The mage shouted, no. And then Grandpa leaned close to Ember and whispered the words that shattered the darkness. You were never meant to be a weapon. Ember froze. You were meant to be free. Silence fell. The mage whispered in horror, that bond. Impossible. Grandpa coughed blood. His body was failing. His wound from that night was never healed. He smiled sadly at Ember. I am dying, little flame, but I came to give you my last breath, so you can live. Ember's eyes widened in terror. He did not want freedom without Grandpa. He did not want a world where warmth was gone again. But Grandpa placed his trembling hand on Ember's head. One last fire, he whispered. The ritual began. A flame warden's final sacrifice. The collar shattered completely. Chains melted. The dungeon shook as ancient power awake, thundered above. Voices shouted, kill them. Grandpa collapsed to his knees. His hand slipped away. Burn. Not with rage. His voice faded, but with hope. And then Grandpa fell still, silent. Gone. Ember stared at the lifeless body. The world stopped. Then something inside Ember broke open. Not hate, vengeance, grief, love. Storm of sorrow so deep, it became fire. Golden flame exploded through the dungeon, holy and bright. The soldiers screamed as chains turned to ash. The mage's spells collapsed like dust. Ember rose. His broken wings ignited, not flesh, flame wings, wings of freedom. He roared, and the palace trembled above. The empire panicked. They had come for a monster, but they had created a legend. Ember carried Grandpa's body gently in his claws. He did not burn the city. He did not slaughter. His fire was not this, was liberation. He flew to the highest tower where the emperor stood trembling. That dragon is mine. The emperor shouted. Ember's voice echoed like thunder. No, you are cursed. The emperor spat. Ember's golden eyes blazed. I was never cursed. He lifted Grandpa toward the sky. I was loved. Silence fell over the empire. They understood then this was not rebellion. This was consequence. Ember spread his flame wings wide, and instead of burning the world, he released one great wave of light into the heavens. A signal, a promise across mountains and oceans. Hidden dragons felt it. Broken creatures felt it. Hope reaped. Ember flew beyond the empire's reach to a quiet valley where no chains existed. There, beneath an ancient tree, he laid Grandpa to rest. He curled around the grave, his fire burning softly like it always had not, as a weapon has a homeland in the rising dawn. Ember whispered into the wind even. The smallest flame can change destiny even. The weakest soul can defy an empire, because love is the truest fire and it never dies.